All right, welcome everybody. This is the Pacific Islands Area NRCS ECS seminar series for FY17, and today's topic is species selection for habitat restoration. My name is Michael Constantinidis, and my co-presenter today is Jennifer Higashino. And so we'll be going through a series of topics today. We'll start by reviewing, and this will primarily be Jennifer, but myself a bit. We're going to be reviewing a number of different important concepts and considerations that relate to species selection. And we'll transition from there into our PIA Vegetative Specification and the module for selecting plants, and then into a demonstration of building an implementation requirement template, aka job sheet. And so that'll be the flow of today's presentation. We anticipate this being an hour, possibly a little bit more, and we welcome questions along the way. So with that, I will hand over to Jennifer, and she'll take the next section.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Happy Halloween. It's really difficult to encapsulate the range of potential scenarios that planners will be facing when it comes to looking at habitat restoration. But what's key today is we just want to get some concepts across. So it won't necessarily be in super detail, but we're hoping that you'll be able to kind of take some of those questions to ask and considerations and run with those. Oh.
There she goes. You got it.
So the first place to start is kind of what's driving the conversation. If you're thinking of installing wildlife habitat, you got to ask the question, what's your driver? Is a cooperator interested in a particular species, a regional ecosystem? Does a landowner know what they want or what they have already in place? If wildlife is identified as a resource concern, all the elements of the species needs to survive need to be addressed. And so those include food, shelter and cover, water, and space. You have anything to add to that, Michael?
And just as noted on the left there, when we have wildlife projects, we need to identify one or more wildlife or pollinator species that are the target of our planned effort. So you need to sort that out with the cooperator too.
Yeah.
I have a quick question, Jennifer. What is the difference between cover and shelter?
I can tell you. I think it's kind of synonymous. One might serve a different part of the animal's life history. So cover might be, you know, getting out of the sun. Shelter might be too. It's kind of a gray area. I think there's a little overlap with the two.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So one of the first questions you got to ask is the site appropriate for an identified species? If you've got a landowner coming to you saying, we want this area for seabirds or nene or whatever the species is it the right place? And what species are appropriate for the site? And what are some of the sources of information to determine that? I always think that the best place to start is what's there. If there's any kind of remnant vegetation, existing wildlife, there's other sources, including the ecological site descriptions and the veg spec, which Michael will go through a little bit later. But you want to make sure that you're not kind of overstretching your goals in terms of where you're putting what. the picture is a nice example of a restoration project on Maui with the Maui Coastal Land Trust, where they are restoring a number of coastal species. And you can see it was mostly Piave in the past, but it's really nicely filled in at this point.
Jennifer, there was a note just asking to speak a bit louder, please.
Okay, sorry. So continuing on, you're going to be faced with a number of different starting points or baselines. And so you need to figure out what you have to work with to start off with. Are you starting with a site that just needs some enrichment and enhancement? Are you going to be looking at just filling in some species diversity? And there's a couple of notes here that you'd want to refer to. The WAG is BTN 23 and Michael's Forestry Tech Note 11. If you're starting with a bare site, you need to consider what's practical and consider complicating factors. So slope and rainfall are two examples. I'm sure you can come up with many others. But when you're starting with a bare site, it's just going to take that much more effort. Your baseline is a lot lower, and so it's going to take that much more effort to get it together. So maybe sticking with simple lists and pioneer species. And pioneer species are going to be different in every environment you're in, every ecosystem. So if you think of a new lava flow, it's going to be those ferns and ohia, things like that. But again, it's going to be very site specific. These are kind of two examples of very different situations. The one on the left is a site on Lanai. There was a small remnant population of an endangered plant. It's actually that yellow flowered one kind of in the center. But you can see the site is incredibly steep. And they went for kind of a mix of different species. But unfortunately, there's a lot of kind of bare ground, which it's kind of hard to say how well these are going to do, and it's probably going to take a lot more maintenance. You can also see that there was some irrigation set up there, and on that kind of slope, irrigation can be pretty tricky. So that's one example. The other slide on the right is a site on Ulupalakua Ranch where they're trying to establish a'ali'i in a grassland. And so you can see they're starting with a good pioneer species. You see the tall ohia trees in the mist there, but really they're trying to fill in those gaps between the trees. In this case, they had, I think it's mostly kikuyu, but kikuyu and a couple other grass species that they're basically planting within. And so they're spot spraying and creating a thatch to plant these a'ali'i in. And then they could come back later and interplant within that. All my pictures are going to be Maui pictures, sorry. Okay, this is actually that same site, and you can see the same ohia trees. But one other question to ask is, what's the time frame that you're working within? This landowner wanted something that would come in pretty quickly. They also were looking for some species that would provide some future revenue. So in this case, they're growing koa. Originally, it would have been ohia and mamane, but these koa were seen as faster growing. You know, again, a revenue source for the future. And so that's what they went with. You're going to want to think about habitat restoration in the terms of are you trying to restore an ecosystem, or are you just trying to provide what a species needs to survive? So again, if you're looking at the species, you got to look at those essential components: food, whichever one of those covers shelter terms you want to use, water, habitat, and habitat continuity. So that's called space in NRCS world. Lost my train of thought. Yeah, just the context that those species need to survive. Also, you want to consider weed pressure and insect and disease risk. There's a number of new threats out there. Coconut rhinoceros beetle, the cycad scale are examples of insect pests. And then diseases such as coral wilt and rapid ohia death. And I know a lot of people are currently shying away from planting ohia out in areas on the Big Island because either they are afraid that they'll introduce the fungus associated with that disease, or they're just not really sure kind of ohia's future at this point. This is an area that I find really interesting, and that's just the approach you're going to take. And it's going to vary from place to place significantly. But basically, you want to look at species diversity to meet all the needs of the ecosystem or the species. And that's going to help at different stages of the animal's life history, whether it's their food needs, what they need for nesting, all of those things all are incorporated into species diversity. One other consideration is succession and growth rates. We talked about that a little bit. But basically the idea of starting out with pioneer species, not just going for your canopy species right off the bat, but kind of laying the framework in your field for the right types of future growth. So I'm just going to talk about this particular site really quick here. This is Oahe on East Maui, the south slope of East Maui. And they've been working on a restoration project there for about 16 years. It's really held up as one of the premier restoration efforts in Hawaii. They have developed a methodology that really works well for this site, where they spray kikuyu grass. This is I should step back and say this is Ulupalakua Ranch. It's a working cattle ranch, and it's got a remnant forest of really rare and some threatened and endangered species. But that forest you can see in the background is pretty hammered. And so they've identified a couple of locations within this forested area to restore. And their methodology includes spraying the kikuyu, which you can see a sprayed section kind of on the, I should get the pointer, on the lower, pointer's not working for me. On the lower left.
Pointer's there.
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Over here, you can see the sprayed stuff. And then that's followed by a pretty dense planting of a'ali'i, which is an early pioneer species. It grows fast. It provides a lot of leaf litter. And that's planted right in the dead kikuyu. So the kikuyu is acting as a thatch mulch. And then once the a'ali'i have established, the next step that they use is going in and interplanting within the a'ali'i. And so the plants that go in, they have a little bit better conditions to get a good start on. So going down this list a little bit further is, you know, they're working on a scale that that they can manage. They don't spray the whole field. They do what they know they'll be able to plant. And then the maintenance is kind of built into it in that there's good mulch, there's good leaf litter, and you know, there's increased things like water retention and things like that the adult plants need.
Jennifer, can I add a little bit on that slide?
Yeah, please, please.
Thanks. So kind of touching on a few things Jennifer already discussed relating to succession, and she's mentioned pioneer species. When you have sites that are highly disturbed or very open or will be very clear once your site preparation is done, it often is easiest and best to think in a fairly simplistic terms to come up with a planting plan that only has 1, 2, 3, 4 species that are readily available. They grow quickly. They establish well in open, direct sunlight. And to think about your efforts in a very long time frame. So don't try for the complete Cadillac with your very first plan. As Jennifer mentioned, this particular project is now 16 years old, and the a'ali'i, the shrub, is a medium to tall shrub species when it grows vigorously, is much bigger now than it is in the image there. It's well overhead, and underneath there's nothing on the ground except litter from this native plant species. All the grass has been outcompeted. And at this 16-year time frame, they're now engaging in an RCPP project with Renee and her office to come back and do what we would call an enrichment planting, which would be to come and establish all those other desirable native shrub and tree species now that the weed pressure has been kind of dealt with. And so that is a really important ecological concept that is something I encourage you all to consider. We have such tremendous weed pressures all over the Pacific Islands that sometimes it's best to just try and get up on your knees before you really take that next step to get the final desired ecosystem. Thanks.
Yeah, nicely said. So yeah, this is just a really good example of a nice sequential process. And it works here, but every site is going to be different. And so, you know, you kind of need to work out what's going to work at that site. I just wanted to run through a couple of examples of different animal needs that are fairly common in Hawaii and the Pacific. And again, these are addressing those different needs of animals, whether it's food or shelter. And just running through these quickly. Tree roosting bats, which we have here, Pacific wide. They have little different life histories. Ours is an insectivore, in which case vegetation corridors have been found to be really important for them, where they can forage for insects in these vegetation corridors. And then another consideration that you might just think about is how you can minimize disturbance by planting your plantings either away from roads or away from structures, things like that. Water birds are also another big issue in Hawaii. It's good to think about the appropriate nesting structure that you're putting out there. You want low-growing species. You want things that aren't going to hide predators. And then also emergent vegetation so that you're encouraging aquatic insects and some of the food sources that those animals need. Pollinators is a very interesting area. And one thing to consider here is that you want a range of different things flowering at different times of year. And when you've got high elevation sites, you also need to consider that it's not just where you are in the calendar, it's also where you are elevationally. So there's going to be seasonal variation in flowering as you go higher or lower on the mountain. And then also just having discussions with landowners about things like creating no spray zones and being really clear about some of that.
Jennifer, for the water birds, what does emergent vegetation mean or allude to?
Partially submerged vegetation. So I think a lot of us think about planting in terms of above ground, but you can also get things established in ponds as well, or wetlands, and diversify your vegetation in a wetland site.
Thanks.
Sure. And I'm quickly going over these because not all of these apply to everyone, but it's just a quick overview of some examples. For forest birds, not all forest birds just drink nectar or eat insects or eat fruit. There's a wide range of different species needs. Depending on where you are, you're going to want to think about elevation in this particular case too. And again, that range of elevation is going to affect when things are not only flowering but also fruiting. So you want to think about that. Contiguous habitat is very important for different species. If you've got a landowner who's thinking about doing a project on the edge of their field somewhere, look and see what's next door and try and add on to that instead of just, putting it somewhere in the middle of the field or something like that. I know you guys know this, but especially if you've got 4 landowners and you can make one big contiguous habitat among the 4 landowners on a common corner, that's going to be really important, especially we've got a species out on Tinian called the Tinian monarch, which they're considering for listing. And one concern is that changes in land use out there will degrade some of their habitat. And so looking at the forest structure over an area is really important. Nene are pretty common on the Hawaiian Islands, and they're going to have different needs depending on their phase of life history. So are you addressing nesting habitat, shrubs for food resources, and then how are you going to maintain those species when their main food source is reliant on grazing? So kind of looking at different zones for different aspects of their life history. Tree snails are, they're across the Pacific. They generally tend to have be specific to specific host plants. They also need a lot of canopy shelter in terms of kind of maintaining humidity, protection from wind, things like that. So they're kind of a tricky species, but it's one to consider. And then native moths and butterflies, this is kind of a broader range, but again, looking for host plants and you know, mamaki and the Kamehameha butterfly, which is pulelehua. That's a really straightforward example of a native butterfly and a host plant. If you were to plant mamaki, you have a really high probability of pulelehua showing up at the site. Michael?
Okay, thanks. Before I kind of take off on a slightly different direction, any questions or comments at this point? All right, so at the beginning, Jennifer mentioned that this presentation is by nature a bit broad. It's really challenging. I know for the planners, you're all at your jobs trying to come up with a specific list, and you just want to know, hey, how do I come up with the list? And I guess what we're trying to emphasize is it's a combination of several considerations, and that helps you zero in on your answer. So at this point, I would just want to illustrate that there are some really broad categories of vegetation, and this is something to consider yourself and have a good conversation with your cooperators about. And I would offer these 4 categories here on this slide. And with the first one, these are noxious or invasive species that tend to be on many of our sites, and the bottom line with those is we really do want to get rid of them if possible and practical. And if it's something that requires a long-term campaign or effort, if you want to call it that, at least try to document in your conservation plan and in your conversations with your cooperator how you're going to get from point A to point B, with point B being no more of that species left, and trying to get rid of them completely. That being said, we all acknowledge and know that in some cases our invasive species are just too well established to be eliminated completely from a site in practical terms or cost-effective terms. So in those cases, as long as the presence of that species is not compromising our ability to work with cooperators and accomplish a conservation objective and address at least one good resource concern, we work around them and with them, as it were. But where possible, let's try to get rid of those or have a plan to. As an example, sometimes in pastures we have weedy brush species, and when cooperators do brush management, they want to leave some because it provides a little bit of shade for livestock, and we acknowledge that's really important. You can't just create a bare site out of one that was previously shaded. I guess you could, but you might introduce unwanted stress on the animal or herd. So maybe instead of just saying, well, you have to take those all out in day one, you could say, well, go ahead and leave a handful of those as shade, but at the same time, we would encourage you to talk to the cooperator about proactively installing non-invasive or non-noxious species as the future shade that would allow you 5, 10, 15 years down the road to finally remove their last remaining invasive individuals. The second category are non-invasive, non-native species. These are often used when we're installing timber plantations, agroforestry systems. They might be part of a successional phase, as we've discussed a little bit. And we use the Hawaii Pacific Weed Risk Assessment, HPWRA, as an initial screening evaluation criteria, but it isn't final. And so the check marks just show how you would want to proceed depending on that score. So if you're at a 7 or above, that doesn't mean it can't be used. It's just that at that point, Carolyn or Jennifer or myself are going to want to talk to you about that and see if that species is a good fit for your site. The successional phase with non-natives, I'll get to that a little bit later actually, but I'll come back to that. Then we have native species from nearby islands or ecoregions that may actually not be native on your island. So maybe there's a species that's native on Rota that somebody on Guam wants to plant where the species is not known as native. Same thing with Hawaiian Islands. We often have that case between islands and sometimes even between regions on the same island for some of the larger islands here. So that's another category that's kind of interesting. And then the last category is native or endemic, those species which are known from the site. Well, how do you select between those categories? You're going to use the native plant filter in the Veg Spec, which was we previously called the Veg Guide. And we use that filter if the cooperator is really clear in their mind that that's what they want. And we also use that filter when we're employing native ecosystem restoration, pollinator and wildlife habitat restoration projects. Then in other situations, we can search on both native and non-native species in the Veg Spec. And it might be because the cooperator really knows there's particular species that they want to plant. And if it doesn't kind of conflict with our policy and our way of implementing our various practices, then we should support them and give them a list that includes both native and non-native. And then a lot of our cooperators come to us and they just say, I don't know, help me out, what do I do? And so just go over your options with them and point out to them that sometimes non-native species might be a good option. In the savanna in southern Guam, it's a really tough place to get trees and shrubs established, and Bart and his staff have shown me some sites where the Acacia auriculaformis, which is not native, is an interesting successional plant to establish and get the ecosystem kind of stabilized before following up years later with the actual native plants that the cooperator might ultimately be interested in. So that's just worth thinking about. But also go ahead and encourage the native plants. If they have the growth potential and the cooperator is amenable or agreeable to using them, by all means, we ask you to encourage the use of that type of material.
So it's really important to have a discussion with landowners and land managers about T&E species that are either found on the site or if they're interested in planting them. My understanding is that typically we have discouraged the use of threatened and endangered species in restoration projects, except in cases where cooperators are really knowledgeable in horticulture, restoration ecology. They're cognizant of the regulatory framework and they have their permits in place. That said, I think this is a pretty hard stand to take. I mean, you want to make sure that you're following the law, but my personal feeling is that we can work towards getting some processes in place to make this a little bit easier for certain landowners, committed landowners, but that'll be a bit down the line. Endangered species recovery is really going to need the involvement and participation of private landowners. And however we can figure out how to facilitate that, the better. And I've got two pictures kind of illustrating that point. The picture on the left is on private land. It's a nature preserve. I won't name names. But you can see that this plant is not really well planted. It's an endangered gardenia. And I don't think it's still alive. It looks like maybe someone who knew what plants look like, could ID plants, but not someone who really knows much about growing plants. So there's one example. On the right is another example. This is one of, I think there's 7 left in the wild right now, Melicope ascendens. And it was planted on a working cattle ranch. It was probably about as high as this guy's knee when it was planted, but it's really thriving in this environment. And so that's an example of, a successful restoration of a endangered plant species on private land. So there are people to work with, but we need to be careful to make sure that we're following the laws associated with that. I'm sure a lot of folks out there are working with the Plant Extinction Prevention Program. There's also one on Guam, GPEP. And so especially if the landowner is already working with some of these groups, we need to make sure that we're supporting that. Any questions?
So we go case by case, and we can do the endangered species depending on the permits and all that. Like I'm thinking about like Molokai Land Trust. They have all their permits.
Yeah. So Butch and them have permits, and so they should be covered, and that should be good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll contact you. You're the first line of contact.
Yeah, we can talk if you have questions specific to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
And Jennifer, if I can ask a quick question. So I like the direction you're taking this, and that is to hopefully we, NRCS and PIA, can come up with a protocol or process by which, hopefully, relatively streamlined, by which planners can help a client through that process to obtain those permits so that we can include these species in our planting list. Is that correct?
Yes.
That would be great.
Yeah, and there's a couple of mechanisms that should work for that. But just to make sure that everyone is covered, we're following the laws, and the plant recovery community out there really needs private landowners to be involved in their restoration.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we could really make some headway on endangered plant species if we can streamline that process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I like it. Thank you.
All right, so kind of getting down a little bit more detailed, how do we go about then making a specific species list? And as the Hawaii Pacific Weed Risk Assessment is a first approximation for evaluating non-native plants, for generating a planting list, the plant selection module of the PIA vegetative spec should be your first step in terms of coming up with a planting list. So we encourage you to use that as your starting point and to create an initial cut of a plant list. And as many of you know, but some may not, the veg spec, the plant selection module, keys in on a few important parameters, the island or island group being one, elevation, and annual rainfall. Those are the 3 big ones. And you can enter the soil series in that screening tool, but it's a minor consideration in PIA in a majority of our sites, but not all. Where soils are going to be limiting, maybe it's extremely steep or extremely shallow, maybe there's very low pH or some serious nutrient or physical limitation. In those cases, contact us, but the veg spec is too broad brush of a tool to effectively incorporate all of those things at once. So by and large, we do feel that elevation and rainfall and your location are a very reasonable starting point. So once you have an initial list, try and refine it based on a number of things. What does the cooperator want, and what are they interested in? What's the focus of your project based on all the things that Jennifer and I spoke about previously in this presentation today? It's also really important to start talking about where the material will be sourced from, and many of our cooperators get the materials from commercial sources, and they need to start conversations up early in the game with their suppliers and find out what's actually out there, how long it takes to have plant-ready seedling stock, what sources of materials are available and whatnot. So time frames, lead time, that's all very important. Cost can certainly be a very influential factor, and so finding out what the different prices are from the commercial suppliers is important. And at the bottom there on the left, I talked to Jennifer about this, and we just wanted to throw out a very rough range for projects where you're thinking about doing native ecosystem restoration or habitat enhancement for wildlife. You definitely want moderate to high density plantings. To create the habitat, to make the native plants competitive with the weed pressure, our experience is that you want moderate to high plant density. So there's just some very broad guidelines there. You might go ahead and put in trees at 10-foot spacing and just walk away without planting any shrubs, but just do that as a way to stabilize the site and get that first step of your successional management going. You might plant your trees a little wider and start putting down shrubs in between, and the ratio of trees to shrubs might get, you might have fewer and fewer trees as you get more and more shrubs as your tree spacing gets wider apart. So if you go for 20 or 30-foot tree spacing, you're probably going to need very dense shrub planting in between to cover all those light gaps and help keep the weed pressure under control.
Michael, if I can ask a quick question. I think it was about a year, maybe a year and a half ago, our team put out a guidance document on what's actually available, the various nurseries, did we not?
We did.
Yeah, and how do they find that document?
I'm going to get to that.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Right there.
Oh, very good. Oh.
So at kind of the encouragement and request of Kealakekua Field Office, Laura and Jessica them, we actually created a document that kind of is like Cliff's Notes for people who are getting into a tree and shrub planting conservation plan, and it gives them some broad guidance, some guidance on a wide variety of issues to help them get their project planned correctly and implemented correctly and efficiently. And it's useful, I think, for all of you, but especially for the cooperators. It's meant to be printed out and handed to them. It's available at the Forestry webpage on our PIA website. And yeah, I think it's a pretty nice little document. And so hand that out if you have newer cooperators who may not be as experienced at tree planting. And then try and keep an eye on, and the document says this also, but try and keep an eye on your pest, weed, and disease situation. Try to work with nurseries that are really professional and have really high sanitation protocols. And I encourage you to ask the nurseries about their sanitation protocols and encourage your cooperators to ask that question too, because avoiding the spread of these things is very important, not only to the success of the individual project, but conservation in the islands in general. There's also a list of commercial tree nurseries in our PIA Plant Materials Tech Note 6. And again, Kealakekua folks helped compile a list of nurseries and what they actually had in stock for that particular year. A year ago we did that. And so Laura took the lead on that. It was a wonderful effort, and she came up with a list not only of nurseries, but how many dozen or hundred of each particular species was likely to be available for sale over the next 6 or 12 months. And that's something that Jennifer and I will look at with them again and possibly expand that to other locations. And then we're also talking about coming up with a version of guidelines that we can hand to you folks about the T&E issue, and Jennifer addressed that a few minutes ago. And hopefully when we come up with a way to go through the permitting process and general guidelines on how to engage people when it comes to T&E plant materials, hopefully we'll have that up and available on the biology webpage. And then on our biology and forestry pages, there's a number of other resources. You're encouraged to research there on various plant guidebooks and plant databases and websites that provide information on plants, both desirable species as well as invasive plants and how to control the ones we're trying to get rid of. You're encouraged to, oh geez, Jennifer, I guess you were going to talk about this one.
You're doing great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I want to add that the biology page needs to be updated badly. So we're working on getting some new resources on there that are more current. And the next section, I guess, I want to make sure people know that we're here to help you. If there's any way we can go out in the field with you, or if you've got new staff who just want to go to a nursery and talk about native plants and learn about some of their qualities and potential in a landscape, we can do that. And then there's also just some really tremendous staff in the field offices who have those strong backgrounds in either plants or restoration of native plants. So I just want to make sure that they're recognized, because there's some really great staff out there. And then any kind of publications associated with local plants. And I encourage everyone to take opportunities. If you can go and volunteer at Hakalau or some location, just to broaden your background in native plants and habitat restoration, that would be outstanding.
Just let them know.
Okay, so I think at this point we're done with this presentation, and we're going to switch over to...
So Michael and Jennifer are going to demonstrate the plant screening tool known as VegSpec, and so bear with us. He's going to switch to sharing his screen.
Desktop, right?
Desktop, yeah. There you go. So does everybody see the VegSpec there on the screen? Anybody who doesn't see that? Hopefully you should see it says USDA NRCS in the bottom white box there.
Yeah, it just came up.
And this is a combination, by the way, this is a combination veg specification for all of our planting specs, and also it's your implementation requirement or job sheet, as most of you know. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to run through the tool and do a quick demonstration. So for this demonstration, we selected the island of Hawaii in the state of Hawaii. And the broad assumption was that maybe we would be looking at wildlife project to establish forest for the Hawaiian hoary bat, which is a tree roosting insectivorous bat, as Jennifer mentioned. And so I selected the conservation practice here, and I've input the rainfall and elevation, and I've checked off the native plants only checklist. An interesting, well, one aspect about the rainfall I'd like to go over with you folks about is this is a potentially important and powerful tool in developing your plant list. Let's say you have an annual rainfall of 60 inches, and the rainfall is reasonably well distributed, and you can kind of expect that annual average in the ballpark every year. Then go ahead and put the 60 inches in here. And if you view the species, you'll get a fairly long list. And hang on one sec, I think we have a question. Oh. Okay, I guess people can see the screen, so that's great. So this is a species list that spans just over one page on the output. Well, if you go back and you reconsider your site, what if you're in a site that does get 60 inches annual rainfall but is actually subject to drought on a fairly regular basis, maybe once every 4 or 5 or 6 years? You can reasonably expect a fairly severe drought. Well, that's the kind of site that might take out plants that require 60 inches a year. And what if that drought really turns out to be more like 35 inches of rainfall? This is where you can come in and really effectively modify your proposed planting list and say, well, I'm going to go for the hard worst case scenario or the most extreme conditions. And now you'll see that your list has been reduced by perhaps 20 or 30%. And that might be a more conservative approach for this particular client. And so I just encourage you to use that tool if you, as a kind of way to develop different scenarios. Just play with it a little bit and see what you get, and get a feel for the plants that might be more appropriate for a site and be able to withstand periodic drought. So I'll stick with the 60 inches that I had initially, and you begin implementation requirements. And I've just added the minimal data to kind of get to the meat and potatoes of this demonstration. So I put that this field is a 5-acre field, but because this particular species prefers open corridors to commute along the edges of forest, and that's where their foraging activity is, we're actually only going to plant out 3.5 acres of that 5 acres and leave some corridors open. So we would go to the IR template for area practices. Tree shrub establishment is an area planting practice. And I went ahead and pre-populated this. What I did is I assumed that we would have a couple different tree species. We would have some trees that are at very wide spacing and some that would be at a lesser spacing. So I thought of 12 and 24 feet for those two groups, and then shrubs at 6-foot spacing. And in order to get this tool to work correctly, you pick, these all need to be multiples of each other. The numbers you enter in the blue and yellow columns right here. And the smallest of those numbers is what belongs up here in the upper right. And if you populate those numbers as shown here, it'll help you with calculating quantities of each species or spacing group. A simpler tool to use is coming up right here in this purple box and just saying, well, I have 3.5 acres, and the closest my plants will be spaced is 6 feet apart, and that tells you, well, you can put in about 4,235 trees and shrubs within a grid that would be 6 foot on center. You can take that number, and without monkeying around with any of these spacing groups and all this spacing issue, you can just come right down here and put in 4,235, and that's this other category. And then you can just put in whatever quantities of all these plants you want, and in the narrative box over here is where you would address your spacing for various species, or perhaps over here selection and care of planting material, or in this planting dialog box you might prefer to do a more narrative approach, and that's perfectly okay. If you're in a project that has a complex planting plan for some reason, or you just prefer doing it on your own, maybe on a sketch, then you would go ahead and just use this other spacing group. So that's right here in this row.
And that comes from the purple above.
Well, no, it's just all manual input on this row. You can use this purple value as a guide.
Or if you have your own.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
But this is just a calculator. You might also find out that, hey, this particular nursery has 217 of a particular plant, and I know I want to plant it, and I want it to fill up the 3.5 acres, and I want to plant it as far apart as I can. You could play around with this tool right here and see how many acres it would take at a certain spacing to fill up using a known quantity of plants. So that's just kind of a reverse logic as to over here. But let's say you do want to try and go ahead and use the tool, and you're thinking about shrubs on 6 feet and trees at 2 different spacings. Well, in the first of the examples that I'm going to present here, I'm going to assume that this site is very open, and we might be going for just an initial successional project objective, try to get a basic planting plan, get pioneer species in the ground, get canopy cover over the ground surface to help get that weed situation under control. So if we're doing that, maybe we're only going to use 2 different tree species and 2 different shrub species. And so over here, if we're planting koa or alahe'e as a tree species, we might come in and say, well, we'll plant that at 24-foot spacing. And over here, what this table tells you is for 3.5 acres at 24-foot spacing, you could put a maximum of 264 plants in that field and cover 3.5 acres. Now let's say because it's bare, there's 0 plants existing, and we're going to go ahead and say, yeah, we want to plant all 264. So you would put that in. That adjusts the remaining amount left for the other spacing groups. And then maybe down here we'll say, well, we want to plant mostly koa. So of that 264, we're going to put 200 koa, and we're going to put 64 alahe'e. And there you are, you're done with your trees. And then this table now is telling you, well, if you plant trees at 24 feet and you want to put shrubs in between, you could actually plant close to 4,000 shrubs to fill up all the spaces in between. But let's say this particular project doesn't really want to put that many, and they just want to go with about half that. And they put in 2,000. What that means is your spacing might actually not be 6 by 6, it might be bigger. But that's okay, you know, this may be considered like a minimum spacing. And then maybe they decide they're putting in 1,000 of each of these shrub species that are common, easily obtained, fast-growing native shrub species. So that might be where you're at for an open site and getting a simple planting plan in place that would start getting things going for the hoary bat. I'm going to go on to another example where we're saying this is more of an enrichment planting in a partially existing native forest, but before I do that, I'm going to see if anybody has any questions. Is there one over here?
Michael, I have one. The bee spacing group, how come you didn't include that one in there in this example?
So in this example, I didn't include it because it was more applicable to the second scenario that I'm about to get into.
I see, okay. And this is sort of cooperator dependent. This is meeting the needs of your client.
That's right. Got it. Now, maybe we did want shrubs, but we wanted them wider, so you could have changed them to spacing group B, and that would have suggested, well, you can only plant 794 of those.
Okay.
And so you might have to come back and recalculate, well, if we're going as far as 12 feet apart, maybe it would be 400 of each of these species, or something close to 800.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. So now let's just kind of rewind and assume that the same objective, but there's some pre-existing native vegetation on the site, and we're going to clear around it, but maintain the good native plants will be retained, and then we're going to enrich that planting with additional native species to cover openings and to maybe provide the understory shade-loving species that can be very important for wildlife. Okay, for some reason that doesn't seem happy, so let's see if I can get this to work. Let's see, 7, that's 11. Oh, it's off the screen, so I can't really see what I'm doing.
Oh, yeah. It's off to the left.
All right.
Trying to get 3?
I guess I wanted 8. Let's try this. Okay, it'll let me do that. Okay.
So this is a number of different species. This is your variety.
Right. So now the planting lists have been expanded, and there's a number of additional species in these lists that either represent those that would provide excellent diversity for this wildlife species, or they are shade-loving and they need some of that overstory. So over here, now we're saying that there is some overstory here. And let's say this would be from our talk last week when we talked about inventory. From your inventory, maybe you found out that on this 3.5 acres, there's 160 trees already that are fairly big trees. And maybe there's another 300 in this kind of more medium-sized tree category. And maybe you have a couple hundred shrubs scattered around here and there. So what you'll notice is that when you enter these values here, this tool now comes up and says, well, given that you had enough room for 264, but you have 160, that leaves space for about 104 more. So you might say, okay, well, we're going to plant 104. And that adjusts all the numbers below. And again, between what will be planted or what exists at 24 feet, what exists at 12 feet, we have room for another 494 in category B. So we'll go ahead and put that in. And then finally, we could plant close to 3,000 shrubs at 6 by 6 foot spacing, and maybe we decide to go close to that and shoot for about 2,500. So I'll change my shrubs all back to spacing group C, which is 6 foot spacing. And I would just probably start with my trees and say, well, I'm planting 104 supplemental trees at a wide spacing. And in this case, I'm going to go half and half. So I'm going to put 52 and 52 there. And then, oh, sorry, there's a third species, so
Actually, a fourth, too, further down.
oh, yep, there's 4 species, so maybe a quarter of each, which would be, what would that be, 26? Thanks, Tony. And you can notice over here on the trees, there's this column on the far right that provides some guidance on typical spacing. And that can help you place the different trees in different groups. It's not definitive, but it's just another kind of consideration you can take while you're filling in these data here. And what did I say? For species group B, we're putting in about almost 500. There's 4 of these. So maybe this is 190. And we'll put 100 each of these. So that gets you really close. And you can go exactly to what you had over here if you want, and that's perfectly okay. And then we're talking about 2,500 shrubs, and you could fill out these boxes in any combination of those. But kind of going back to that initial scenario, it might not be a bad idea to lean a little more heavily on your common pioneer species. They tend to be the ones that are cheaper and easier to get and perform really well. So maybe we kind of lean heavily on there and then split up the rest between the other 4 species. So that's 2,500 shrubs, 594 trees for a total of just over almost 3,100 seedlings. Any questions on that or comments?
Michael, question. So we're going to pay, like that one, you got 2,000 something plants. You can pay them on the plant?
Right. That would be correct. You do pay per plant for tree shrub establishment, and all the other tree and shrub planting practices are in the cost list at a per plant basis.
So one of the things that Molokai Land Trust here kind of preaching pretty hard is the heavy density, because you want to compete against the invasives and the non-natives. They do better. So some other guys are kind of leaning that way, but the prices go way up.
Yeah, because the sheer quantity jumps up. So, for example, you mentioned that Molokai Land Trust, they actually, I know that they like to plant at 3 by 3 feet.
Yeah.
Well, look at that. That jumps up our planting plan to 17,000 plants, whereas this one is 3,000. There's no right or wrong answer, but the kind of line I guess I had to draw in the sand was I really felt like after consulting and talking it through with a lot of my peers that when you use 5-foot spacing as kind of the ceiling, you still have a very good plant density and you have a very high expectation of a very good native canopy cover, and that comes out to about a little over 1,700 plants per acre. Still a tremendous amount of funds. You know, that's at $10 a seedling, that's $17,000 per acre just to get it planted out. So I guess we just felt like a least cost alternative approach philosophy that NRCS tends to fall back on would be like using 5 by 5 foot as a ceiling. And so if somebody like Molokai Land Trust wants to go to a higher ceiling with 3 by 3 feet, and by higher ceiling I mean a greater plant density per acre, they're welcome to do that, but I would want to invite them to do the above and beyond the NRCS level on their own.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there's any way we can pick that up as a CTA deal. I don't know, sometime we got to think about it. You know,
I don't see.
there might be some way to pick it up as CTA. We're just talking. Anyway, thank you.
I think, Wally, if they planted that number as the final product, you could still report that number in terms of product or in terms of accomplishment in the context of CTA, but in terms of payment, it would just be for what the contract was for. So, yeah, I think you could pick it up for CTA to say, here's what we actually planted out there per our recommendation or per our consultation with this client.
So one other thing is right now this example is showing 8 tree species and 6 shrub species. A little farther down here in the template in the selection and care of planting materials section, there's a place where you can suggest, well, okay, of the listed plants, the plants in the list above, how many are you going to require to certify this practice? And this can be useful because if you go a little lower than the list, it gives the cooperator some breathing room for unexpected contingencies. So maybe the nursery promised a certain number of seedlings, but there was a problem, or maybe they couldn't get the seed, or maybe the species list you came up with is more diverse than what the commercial market can really provide. So building in a little bit of flexibility by making your species list slightly longer and then allowing a slightly lower level per category is one way to help build in a better chance for success.
So what does that number 5 mean on trees or 4 on shrubs? What is that?
So what that's saying is, of these 8 tree species in the green section, cooperators required to plant at least 5.
Oh, I see.
And
so the upper part, sort of the recommendation, the minimum they have to do is at least 5 of those.
right. Sorry, I didn't explain that more clearly. So that helps.
No, that's good. And is that a planner determined level? Is it up to them to decide?
It is.
Okay. So
Yep.
just using their judgment.
Correct.
Cool. So they can give their clients a little flexibility and still meet the intent of the specification.
That's what we were hoping for. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
My hunch is some of you might be new to this tool, and if you are, don't be shy about contacting Michael and or Jennifer to have them walk you through it first time if you're not able to find somebody locally that can help you. But it's a pretty amazing tool in that it combines both the specification for every planting practice as well as the IR or job sheet, and hopefully makes it streamlined for you folks to produce these IR documents to hand to your clients so that they have the site-specific specs to both purchase their materials and know how to plant them.
Well, thanks, everybody. I appreciate your participation. A week from today, I'll be back again talking about a similar subject, but geared more towards agroforestry and mixed agroforests, multi-story cropping, and related topics. Thanks for your questions, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, guys.